Cycles. Everything in life has to do with timings and cycles and schedules and rhythms. In astrology, all the planets also have different timing cycles and rhythms and cadences. And this is one of the most important and useful things about Vedic astrology that separates it from different forms of astrology. Is it really specializes in understanding these cadences, these cyclic eras of the different planets and the different subcycles within them. When you look at a birth chart, you're looking at a single frame, a single picture, the person's whole life encapsulated into one image. It's like a snapshot of their entire life in one. But we know actually that life moves. It's like this train moving, it doesn't stay in one spot. It's like a movie. It has many pictures, frame after frame after frame after frame. So when you take a birth chart and use the cycles as well, the Vedic cycles, then you can understand how this single picture of a birth chart will translate into different frames throughout a person's life. So you'll understand not just what's been promised to a person by destiny, but when will that promise be fulfilled for that person. So the Vedic planetary cycles are not based on the solar zodiac, but based on the lunar zodiac. What is the lunar zodiac? The lunar zodiac is a system of 27 signs, whereas the solar zodiac is 12 signs. So they're quite related. The solar zodiac has 12 signs because each sign represents the space covered by the sun during one cycle of the moon from full to full. The lunar zodiac is exactly the opposite. It has 27 signs because it represents the space covered by the moon in the course of one solar cycle of one day and night. So this lunar zodiac of lunar mansions is very important in Vedic astrology, in Chinese astrology, and in ancient forms of Western astrology as well. And it's the basis on which the chronological cycles of Vedic astrology are calculated. Vedic planetary cycles are just like music in a sense. They have a certain rhythm, a certain cadence, which is very musical. In a song you have measures which divide the song into smaller units, and within each measure there's notes, quarter notes, whole notes, half notes, eighth notes, which have different durations in proportion to the duration of the measure. So the same way the planetary cycles are exactly like that. Each of the 9 planets gets a certain duration of time in proportion to the greater cycle that it's in. And the greatest of all cycles lasts for 120 years. There's 9 planets. 9 planets, 27 signs. So 27 divided by 9 is 3. So you'll have a pattern of 9 planets repeating 3 times. And a certain pattern follows, and that's the order of the cycles. It starts with Ketu, goes to Venus. From Venus goes to Sun, from Sun to Moon, from Moon to Mars, from Mars to Rahu, from Rahu to Jupiter, from Jupiter to Saturn, from Saturn to Mercury, and that's the complete pattern of 9 planets. So the rhythm of the universe is constantly going on in these cycles of 9 repeating rhythms, and it's the same for everybody all over the world. But each different individual is born into a different place within this rhythm. So the way that you know what place an individual is born at, what place they start at in this rhythm, is by seeing in their chart which lunar sign the moon occupies. So if the moon occupies a lunar sign owned by Saturn, then the person begins their life in the cycle of Saturn. If the person's moon was in a lunar sign owned by Jupiter when they were born, then they'll start their life in the cycle owned by Jupiter. And then once your starting cycle is determined, the rest of them follow naturally like for everyone. same pattern over. So based on the lunar sign that the moon was in when you were born, that will be your first planetary cycle. The planet owning that lunar sign will be the planet who rules your first cycle in your life. But there's something more to this. The amount of space that the moon has moved into that sign is important. If the moon has moved halfway through that lunar sign, then half of that planetary cycle will have already elapsed before you were born. So let's take an example. So if you're born with the moon in a lunar sign owned by the moon, then the moon is going to be your first cycle. The moon cycle lasts for 10 years. Well, you'll only get a 10-year lunar cycle if you were born right when the moon first entered the lunar sign. So if you were born right as the moon first entered that lunar sign, then you'll get the full duration of that planet cycle. So you would get a 10-year cycle of the moon. Let's say you weren't born when the moon exactly first entered. Let's say, for the sake of easy math, you were born when the moon was exactly halfway through the sign, had moved in to the halfway point. You would have half of the moon's duration left in your life after you were born. So you would have 5 years. 5 years, half of 10, to live within the moon cycle before it switched to the next cycle, Mars. Or, to give a third example, if you were born when the moon was at the very end, just before the end, then you may only have a day left within the moon cycle before it switches to Mars. So in this way, the position of the moon, how far the moon has gone into the lunar sign that it occupies, determines how much of that planet's cycle has already elapsed by the time you were born. So how do you use this information in a birth chart, in interpreting a birth chart? Well, you remember that in the chart, the planets have made promises. But you don't really know just from the chart if the planets are going to fulfill their promise, or when they're going to fulfill their promise. When you consider the cycles, you get a understanding of whether or not those planets will be able to fulfill their promises and when they might be able to do so. For example, let's say that there's a planet in the birth chart which is terrible for some reason, but that planet never has a chronological cycle in the person's lifespan. That's a pretty good thing. Maybe it means that terrible promise in the birth chart is never going to get a chance to be fulfilled. Or on the other hand, let's say that there's a great promise in the birth chart. Let's say the moon is wonderful in this person's birth chart. And the chronological cycle of the moon is in such a place to be prominent in that person's life. Let's say the person was born into it, or the person is becoming an adult during a moon cycle. Then you know, conversely, that the promise made by the moon in that chart is going to be very important. It is going to be actually manifest in the person's life. So you have a birth chart. It has a whole bunch of promises in it. You don't really know which ones are going to come true for the person until you look at the cycles, and then you know, this planet is going to have the opportunity to fulfill its promise, whereas that planet is not going to have the opportunity. So by looking at the cycles, you see how the influence of time affects the planet's abilities to fulfill their promises. So we've discussed all of the theory about what these cycles are, why they're important. Now let's have some more fun. In the next part, let's talk about how the cycles manifest in a real person's life. And since the past few episodes have been talking about Krishna and his horoscope, we'll continue that theme in this episode. And we'll look at how the planetary cycles affected Krishna, the incarnation of Godhead, the incarnation of Vishnu, in his life. It'll be quite exciting, so that will be in the next part.